The ice cubes clinked against the glass as Margaret lifted it to her lips, the afternoon sun streaming through the cafe window like an interrogation light. Her son David had been unusually quiet during lunch, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that spoke of secrets rather than impatience. When he suddenly stood, fumbled for his wallet, and threw down 3 crisp 20s with trembling hands, Margaret felt the first cold whisper of unease crawl up her spine. He kissed her cheek too quickly, his lips dry and hurried, and muttered something about an urgent meeting that couldn't wait. The door chimed his departure, and Margaret sat alone, the untouched iced tea sweating condensation onto the checkered tablecloth. She brought the glass to her lips again, ready to quench a thirst she hadn't noticed until now. The liquid was cold, almost too cold, and beneath the sweetness lurked something bitter that made her tongue recoil. Margaret set the glass down with a frown, her wedding ring clicking against the rim, when a shadow fell across her table. Harold Finch from 3 houses down stood there, his weathered face grave as a funeral director's, his eyes holding the kind of knowledge that ruins lives. His voice came out barely above a whisper, each word measured and heavy as stones dropping into still water. "That wasn't lemon in your drink, Margaret." Harold's gnarled hand gripped the back of the empty chair where David had sat moments before. His knuckles were white, the veins standing out like rivers on a map leading nowhere good. Margaret's heart began to pound against her ribs, a prisoner desperate for escape, as Harold's eyes darted toward the door, then back to her glass. The old man had been a pharmacist for 40 years before retirement, and his expression now carried the weight of professional certainty mixed with personal dread. Margaret's fingers went numb around the glass, her mind racing through a labyrinth of impossible questions. Had David meant to harm her? His own mother who'd raised him alone after his father's sudden death 15 years ago? Or was there something darker at play, a web she'd stumbled into without knowing the spider watched from the shadows? Harold pulled out the chair and sat down heavily, his breathing labored, as if the truth he carried was a physical burden crushing his chest. The cafe around them buzzed with ordinary conversation, laughter from the corner booth, the hiss of the espresso machine, all of it suddenly feeling like a stage set hiding something rotten behind the painted scenery. "I need you to listen very carefully," Harold said, leaning forward until Margaret could smell the coffee on his breath and see the fear swimming in his pale blue eyes. His next words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like refugees fleeing disaster. "Your son isn't who you think he is, and what you almost drank wasn't meant to hurt you. It was meant to make you forget." Margaret's world tilted on its axis, the cafe spinning slowly around her like a carousel of nightmares. The glass sat between them now, evidence of a crime she couldn't yet name, while outside the window, David's car remained parked at the corner, its dark windows reflecting nothing but questions that had no easy answers. Margaret stared at Harold, her throat constricting as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from her lungs. The old man's revelation hung in the space between them like smoke from a gun, acrid and impossible to ignore. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the paranoid ramblings of a lonely widower who spent too much time watching crime dramas. But Harold's expression held no madness, only the terrible clarity of someone who'd seen behind a curtain they wished had remained closed. His hand trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket, and Margaret found herself leaning back instinctively, suddenly afraid of this neighbor she'd known for a decade. "3 weeks ago, I saw David at the Westbrook Pharmaceutical Warehouse on Route 9. Harold said, pulling out a small notepad with pages filled in cramped handwriting. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, a skeletal monument to economic collapse that teenagers used for dares and drug deals. Margaret shook her head, ready to offer a reasonable explanation. Maybe David was scouting locations for his real estate firm. But Harold continued, his voice dropping even lower. "He was with Victor Reeves and the Cardona brothers, Margaret. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The names hit her like physical blows. Victor Reeves was currently awaiting trial for manufacturing synthetic drugs, and the Cardonas had been suspects in at least 4 unsolved disappearances over the past 2 years. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound emerged, as if her voice had abandoned her when she needed it most. She thought of David as a child, the boy who'd cried over injured birds and refused to kill spiders. She remembered his college graduation, the pride shining in his eyes when he landed his first job, the way he'd held her hand at his father's funeral and promised to always take care of her. That David couldn't possibly be the same man Harold was describing, a man who consorted with criminals in abandoned warehouses. Yet something in her chest twisted with a recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. All those late-night phone calls he'd insisted were work. The expensive watch he couldn't quite explain, the way his eyes had gone cold and distant over the past year. Harold flipped through his notepad with arthritic fingers, stopping at a page covered in dates and times. "I've been following him, Margaret. I know how that sounds, but after what happened to my Emily last year, I couldn't just look away. His wife Emily had died in what the police ruled an accidental overdose, found in their garden with a needle in her arm despite never having touched drugs in her 72 years of life. The case was closed within a week, filed away and forgotten like so many others in this town that pretended to be peaceful while rot festered beneath its surface. Harold's obsession with finding the truth had cost him friends, earned him reputation as the neighborhood conspiracy theorist. But looking at his notes now, Margaret wondered if he'd been right all along. "The substance in your drink is called Reminol 7, Harold said, his finger jabbing at a chemical formula scrawled in the margin of his notes. "It's experimental, not approved by the FDA, designed for patients with severe PTSD to suppress specific memories without damaging overall cognitive function." Margaret felt bile rising in her throat as the implications crashed over her like a wave of ice water. Her son had tried to erase her memory, which meant she must have seen or heard something dangerous enough to require such desperate measures. But what? She'd spent the last week doing nothing unusual. Grocery shopping, her book club meeting, that charity event at the community center where David had insisted on accompanying her despite his busy schedule. What had she witnessed that warranted this violation, this chemical lobotomy disguised as a glass of iced tea? Margaret's hands began to shake, the tremor starting in her fingertips and spreading through her body like an earthquake's warning tremors. She tried to remember the charity event 3 nights ago, pushing her mind through a fog that seemed to thicken the harder she concentrated. There had been speeches about community development, a silent auction for local art, tables of donors in expensive suits writing checks with practiced smiles. David had stayed close to her all evening, his hand on her elbow, steering her away from certain conversations, his body blocking her view when she'd tried to approach the mayor's wife. At the time, she'd thought he was being protective, perhaps embarrassed by his mother's tendency to overshare stories. Now, through Harold's lens of suspicion, every gesture took on sinister significance. "Did you eat or drink anything unusual that night?" Harold asked, his notepad open to a fresh page, pen poised like a detective conducting an interview. Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that evening in the community center's grand hall with its crystal chandeliers and parquet floors. She'd had champagne, just 1 glass because she didn't drink much anymore, and some canapes from the circulating waiters with their black vests and practiced invisibility. Nothing had tasted strange. Nothing had made her feel drugged or disoriented. But there had been that moment in the corridor outside the restrooms, when she'd heard voices raised in anger behind a closed door, the mayor's distinctive baritone mixed with someone younger, more desperate. She opened her eyes and found Harold watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I heard something," she said slowly, the memory crystallizing like ice forming on a winter window. An argument. The mayor was threatening someone, saying they'd made promises they couldn't keep, that there would be consequences if certain information became public. Harold's pen scratched across the paper, his breathing shallow and quick. Margaret continued, the scene unfolding in her mind with sudden clarity. "I started to knock, to see if everything was all right, but David appeared out of nowhere and pulled me away. He said I was being nosy, that it was just political theater, nothing for me to worry about." The cafe suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with secrets and the smell of burned coffee. Margaret realized that other patrons were glancing their way, some with curiosity, others with something that looked like concern or perhaps warning. Harold noticed too, his body tensing like an animal sensing predators. He leaned closer, his breath hot against Margaret's ear as he whispered, "The voice you heard arguing with the mayor, did you recognize it?" She hadn't at the time, or thought she hadn't. But now with the question posed directly, a terrible recognition bloomed in her chest. It had been David, her son, threatening the mayor of their quiet suburban town with exposure of secrets that required memory-erasing drugs to protect. "We need to leave now." Harold's urgency snapped Margaret from her spiraling thoughts. He grabbed her purse from the chair and pressed it into her hands, his eyes darting toward the street where a black sedan had pulled up behind David's parked car. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements synchronized and purposeful, the kind of coordination that spoke of training and bad intentions. Margaret's legs felt like water as Harold hauled her to her feet, his surprising strength propelling her toward the cafe's back exit. Behind them, the front door chimed, and Margaret risked a glance over her shoulder to see the men entering, their eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency until they locked onto her fleeing form. The game, whatever it was, had just become deadly serious. The alley behind the cafe reeked of rotting produce and broken dreams, dumpsters overflowing with the waste of American plenty. Harold's hand gripped Margaret's wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. Pulling her through puddles she tried not to think about and past fire escapes that clung to brick walls like metal skeletons. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her comfortable lunch outfit of slacks and a cardigan suddenly feeling like a costume from a life that had ended the moment Harold spoke those words about lemons that weren't lemons. Behind them she heard the cafe's back door bang open, followed by the measured footsteps of men who didn't need to run because they knew their prey had nowhere to go. Harold yanked her left, through a gap between buildings so narrow their shoulders scraped against brick on both sides. Margaret's mind raced with questions that had no time for answers. Who were these men? Why did they want her? And how had her son become entangled in something that required armed pursuers in broad daylight? They emerged onto Maple Street, the familiar neighborhood suddenly foreign and threatening, every parked car a potential hiding place for more hunters. Harold's breath wheezed in his chest, his face flushed an alarming shade of crimson, but he didn't slow down. He pulled her toward his old Buick parked 3 blocks away, its faded blue paint and dented bumper suddenly looking like salvation. "Get in, don't argue, stay low," Harold commanded, shoving her toward the passenger side while he fumbled with keys that seemed determined to escape his shaking fingers. Margaret crouched in the footwell, her knees protesting the position, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The engine coughed to life on the 3rd try, and Harold pulled into traffic with a screech that drew honks from other drivers. Through the gap between the seat and door, Margaret watched her town scroll past. The hardware store where she'd bought gardening supplies last week, the library where she volunteered every Tuesday. All of it now feeling like stage props in a play where she'd been given a script but couldn't read the ending. "We're going to my storage unit," Harold said, his voice steadier now that they were moving, though his knuckles remained white on the steering wheel. "I have evidence there, documents and photographs that Emily collected before she died. She was investigating the town council's approval of that new development on the wetlands, the one your son's real estate firm is managing." Margaret felt the pieces of the puzzle start to arrange themselves, though the picture they formed was monstrous. David's sudden wealth, his new connections with powerful people, the way he discouraged her questions about his work, all of it pointed to corruption that ran deeper than a simple bribe. But murder? Memory manipulation? These were the tools of desperate men protecting something worth killing for. Harold took a sharp turn into the self-storage facility on the outskirts of town, its rows of orange metal doors stretching like prison cells under the afternoon sun. He parked in front of Unit 247, hands shaking as he worked the combination lock. The door rolled up with a metallic shriek, revealing not the usual boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture, but a conspiracy theorist's command center. Corkboards covered the walls, red string connecting photographs of town officials, David, the Cardona brothers, and dozens of others Margaret didn't recognize. Financial records, newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths, and chemical formulas covered every surface. In the center of it all was a photograph of Emily Finch, Harold's dead wife, her kind eyes staring out from the evidence board like an accusing ghost. Margaret stepped inside and the door rolled shut behind her, sealing her into a truth she could never unknow. Margaret stood frozen in the dim storage unit, her eyes trying to process the magnitude of Harold's obsession, or perhaps his sanity, spread across the walls like a spider's web of paranoia made manifest. But as she stepped closer, the details began to crystallize into something horrifyingly coherent. Bank statements showing payments from shell corporations to city council members, photographs of late-night meetings at the abandoned warehouse, and most damning of all, a toxicology report from Emily's autopsy that differed significantly from the official police report. Harold moved past her with the certainty of a man who'd walked this path 1,000 times, his fingers trailing along the red string until they stopped at a cluster of photographs showing David in deep conversation with men whose faces Margaret recognized from news reports about organized crime. Emily discovered that the wetland development wasn't really about condos and shopping centers. Harold's voice emerged hollow and distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. It's a money laundering operation, Margaret. Millions of dollars from synthetic drug sales flowing through legitimate construction contracts, with your son serving as the respectable face of the entire operation. He pulled down a ledger, its pages covered in Emily's meticulous handwriting, dates and amounts that told a story of corruption so vast it made Margaret's head spin. The old man's hands trembled as he turned the pages, stopping at an entry dated 3 days before Emily's death. Confronted DF about JR's involvement. He knows I know. David Reeves tried to warn me off. Feel like I'm being watched. The initials clicked into place with sickening clarity. DF was David Finch, Harold's son who lived in Seattle and rarely visited. JR was James Reeves, Victor's younger brother, currently serving as assistant district attorney. Margaret felt the walls of the storage unit pressing in, the conspiracy expanding to swallow everyone she'd trusted, every institution that was supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of evil. Harold's face had gone pale, his breathing labored, and Margaret realized with alarm that he was clutching his chest, his jaw clenched against pain that was either emotional or something far worse. She reached for him as his knees buckled, his weight suddenly too much for his aging body to support. Pills, Harold gasped, pointing to a metal filing cabinet in the corner. Top drawer, Nitro. Margaret lunged for the cabinet, yanking it open with such force that folders spilled across the concrete floor, photographs of her son scattering like accusations. She found the small brown bottle, her fingers struggling with the child-proof cap while Harold slumped against the corkboard, pulling down strings and photographs in his descent. She pressed 2 pills under his tongue, her own heart racing with fear of losing the only person who could help her understand this nightmare. Harold's breathing gradually slowed, his color returning by degrees, but his eyes held an apology that terrified her more than anything else she'd seen today. They killed Emily because she wouldn't stop digging, Harold whispered, his voice raw and broken. And they'll kill you too, Margaret, unless we can get this evidence to someone outside the local system. Someone they don't own. He pulled himself up using the corkboard, pieces of his wife's investigation clinging to his clothes like ghosts refusing to let go. Margaret heard it then, the sound of a car pulling up outside, doors opening and closing with the soft thud of expensive engineering. Through the crack under the storage unit door, she saw shadows moving, heard the murmur of voices coordinating their search. Harold's eyes met hers in the dim light, and she saw the calculation happening behind them, the terrible mathematics of sacrifice. He moved toward the door, his body positioning itself between Margaret and whatever was coming, his hand reaching for something hidden behind a stack of boxes, a gun that looked older than both of them combined. The gunshot shattered the afternoon silence like glass breaking in a cathedral, and Margaret's scream died in her throat as Harold fired not at the door, but at the padlock of the adjacent storage unit. The metal exploded in sparks, and Harold kicked the door open, revealing a narrow passage he'd apparently cut through the shared wall. His paranoia transformed into providential escape route. He shoved Margaret through, her hip banging against the metal frame hard enough to leave bruises, while behind them, the voices outside Unit 247 erupted into shouts and the sound of bolt cutters attacking the lock. Harold followed, his bulk barely fitting through the makeshift tunnel, and they emerged into a unit filled with nothing but empty boxes, camouflage and misdirection that bought them precious seconds. They ran through the maze of storage corridors, Harold navigating with the confidence of a man who'd planned for this moment, even if he'd prayed it would never come. Margaret's lungs burned, her comfortable life of book clubs and charity events having left her unprepared for sprint training in late middle age. Behind them, the pursuers spread out with military precision, their footsteps echoing off metal doors like a countdown to inevitable capture. Harold pulled her behind a maintenance shed, his hand clamping over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing as two men passed within arm's reach, their faces obscured by the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. She recognized one voice, David's business partner, Marcus Chen, a man she'd welcomed into her home for dinner just last month. When the men passed, Harold removed his hand and pressed something into Margaret's palm, a USB drive warm from his pocket and small enough to hide in a clenched fist. Everything Emily found is on this. Her notes, the financial records, video footage she took at the warehouse. If something happens to me, you get this to Special Agent Sarah Chen at the FBI field office in Boston. She's Marcus's sister, and she's been working her own investigation into the operation. Margaret wanted to argue, to insist they stay together. But the look in Harold's eyes told her this was the moment he'd been building toward since Emily died. His chance to finally make her murder mean something. He'd been waiting to become a martyr, and Margaret realized she couldn't stop him from embracing that terrible destiny. Harold created the distraction by stepping out into plain view, his hands raised, the ancient gun dangling from one finger like a white flag of surrender. Margaret watched through a crack in the shed as Marcus and three others converged on the old man, their movements cautious but confident. Harold was talking, his voice carrying across the facility with the practiced projection of someone who'd spent years behind a pharmacy counter counseling customers. He was confessing, spinning a tale of delusion and grief, a lonely widower who'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain his wife's death, because accepting her addiction was too painful. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Harold sell his own sanity to buy her escape, making himself look like exactly what the town already believed him to be, a crazy old man whose evidence was worthless ravings. She didn't see who fired the shot, only saw Harold crumple to the ground, his blood spreading across the concrete like spilled wine at a communion service. Marcus was shouting at the others, genuine shock in his voice that suggested this hadn't been the plan. But Margaret couldn't stay to parse the politics of murder among thieves. She ran for the facility's back fence, the USB drive clenched in her sweating palm, Harold's sacrifice propelling her over chain link she'd never have thought herself capable of climbing. She dropped to the other side and kept running, her son's face burned into her memory, transformed from beloved child to stranger who'd tried to steal her mind. The FBI field office in Boston was 3 hours away, but Margaret Reeves had nothing left to lose except the truth, and that was something no drug could make her forget. Behind her, sirens began to wail, too late for Harold, but perhaps, if she kept running, just in time for justice that had been delayed for far too long in this town of pretty lies and buried bodies.